certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Almost a year to the day, on the 25th of November 2019, the trial of the century got underway. The biggest, most expensive and most anticipated case in WA criminal history. Together, through this podcast, we embarked on a legal journey in what would be an extraordinary trial that finally led to justice. Hello and welcome to Claremont in Conversation, this special episode recorded in front of a live audience at the University of Western Australia. I'm Natalie Bonjolo, and joining me today we have Kate Ryan, our podcast producer, veteran court reporter from Channel 7, Alison Fan, and West Australian's legal affairs editor and author of Enigma of the Dark, Tim Clarke. It's good to be back with you all again.
Yeah. They keep using that veteran word.
Yes, I know. Don't you love it, Tim?
I do.
We get told off every time afterwards for using the word veteran. So, Tim, we've spent the better part of the last week locked in the studio listening to your lovely voice, and you've been narrating your audiobook to us. And despite the amount of information that we heard in court during this trial, I think what to me, when I've been listening to you, is just absolutely gobsmacking is the amount of information that didn't go before the trial, and that's some of the ththings we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, there was a bit. It's hard to believe, given that it was 7 months of evidence, 200 and odd witnesses, and terabytes and terabytes of information, and there was still stuff that was left over. In the book I've tried to sort of bring it all together and use some of that stuff that didn't make the trial but was out there in previous hearings and previous judgments, and obviously other stuff that I've sort of dug up along the way. So I've tried to bring it all together, and you two, like you wouldn't be sick of my voice already. They had to sit there for a week last week and listen to me read it. So, that was great as well, because when you're writing it, you're not actually reading it; you're just writing it. So it was good to get it out one last time. I'll probably put it on a shelf and never think about it again.
Well, we felt quite privileged because we had a private audience, and have you reading the book to us in the studio was fantastic. So let's talk about some of those details. Now, we know Edward's criminal past begins in 1988 in Huntingdale on Valentine's Day when he breaks into a room. He pins a young woman down while she's sleeping. Luckily, that attack is thwarted. He leaves behind a kimono. But the interesting thing is, in the months before that attack, there was some very strange goings-on in Huntingdale.
Very odd indeed. So as you say, that is the start of the criminal part of the story, but the story begins many, many years before that, as we found out in bits during the trial. But that little portion of the story begins a month or so before in Huntingdale, which people who are from that area will know. It was a new build area at that time in 87, 88. So there were a lot of new houses being built, some of them without even fences at the back, and they were all square blocks, pretty standard. But it was a very tightly knit sort of community. And so when in mid-January, in a place in Harpenden Street, some women's underwear and a kimono went missing off a washing line. It was strange, but it was one of those things. Then on the 21st of January 1988, just down the road, there was a report of a man trying to break in to a house. He's thwarted, he runs off, but at the time, the woman later tells the authorities he's wearing a wraparound garment, like a sarong or a nightie or something silky. So that's two. Then on the same day, a little bit later on in the morning, on the same street in Huntingdale Road, he does break in to another house and is spotted in the spare room going through the dresser drawer, wearing a blue satin nightie. So that's three. Then 2 days later, a man tries to break into a house on Huntingdale Road. He's disturbed by a dog. That's four. 28th, man appears over a fence. A woman there recognised the man from the previous break-in a couple of nights before. So now within the space of, a week, you've got a distinct pattern already. There's 4 more of these. In February, a woman's clothing stolen from the washing line, including a white kimono. Then you've got a woman waking up to find a man wearing the kimono rifling through her knicker drawer. Then in February the 11th, you've got another report of a man trying to break into a house with at the back sliding door. And then on the 15th, or the night of Valentine's Day and into the 15th, that's when the Huntingdale break-in happens, and the young teenage girl is attacked, and the kimono is left behind.
Yeah.
So you've got a distinct pattern there, obviously. Yep. Very similar circumstances, very similar reports, very similar descriptions of the man, about 180 centimetres tall, sort of maybe early to mid-20s, dark hair, short cut, and then you've got the break-in. But that wasn't the end of it, because in the October of the same year, at 78A Harpenden Street, a woman is having a shower before she goes to bed. And she lets her cat out and then goes to the shower and leaves her door open. When she exits the shower, she notices the door to the toilet is shut, which she thinks is a bit strange because she never shuts it but doesn't think anything of it. Walks down the hall. A person wearing a nightie and wearing a pair of women's underwear on their head, with using the leg holes for eyes, attacks her, jumps her, and tries to restrain her. She fights back, luckily, kicks him in a vulnerable part of the anatomy, which you can imagine where that might be, given that he's wearing a nightie, and he escapes. Yeah. And so you've got that bulk of incidents in a very short space of time, including the one that obviously we now know a lot about, but didn't know anything about then, because even though it was reported and some effort was put in to trying to find who that man was, they hit a brick wall, literally hit a brick wall, and they couldn't get any further, really.
And you can understand, I mean, at the time, these things, really, the first ones are very much peeping Tom kind of incidents, which you wouldn't expect to make the media at the time. Ali, you would have seen some very unusual things in your 50 years reporting from inside courtrooms. Have you seen examples of this where you've seen this kind of escalation?
Well, I've seen plenty of examples of escalation where you've got petty offenders who've been jailed, graduated as hardened serious criminals. You've seen domestic violence, which has escalated into murder. But a random serial killer, they're in a category of their own, and that's why they're so hard to detect. There are no alarm bells, no symptoms, no warning signs. You've got Eric Edgar Cook, who is probably our worst. Quiet family man, helped his neighbour take out the rubbish, and there was no pattern. His victims were a young man, a middle-aged man, a young female babysitter, but it's just all over the place. And then you had, of course, the Bernies, David and Catherine Burney, who virtually came out of the blue. No record, no previous indication of what they were about to do. And the Bernies even had the distinction of being caught and identified before they discovered the victims' bodies. So even when the girls go missing, and like with the Bernies, and I have found in my experience with police, they are very, very reluctant to even mention the word serial killer. Yes. I don't know to this day why that is, whether they feel it might hamper or restrict the investigation, but they get very, very angry when the media starts talking about a serial killer. And we don't do it very often. It's usually when there's like 3 to 4 girls, as with the Bernies, went missing over a period of weeks. Girls who have got no history, family, good background, that sort of thing. So it is a very strange thing, but with serial killers, especially in WA, cross-dressers are not going to turn into serial killers, and that's all that would have been seen as at the time. Peeping Tom, cross-dresser, that was it.
Yeah, and I know, there are so many cases around the world, and Kate, when you were researching for this podcast, you came across many cases overseas that had, really startling similarities to Claremont.
Yeah, and just being a true crime buff myself anyway, you just, all of this just looked like the pattern of a serial killer. Obviously the most recent case, I guess, would be the Golden State Killer. That's probably one that escalated from burglary to rape and then murder. Joseph D'Angelo, he was only arrested in 2018 and very recently jailed for life. But it's so stark how similar this case is, because one of the main investigators who actually helped catch him was Paul Holes, and he said a breakup with his fiancée may have started this reign of terror. So emotional turmoil may have actually started the Golden State Killer. He was responsible for more than 120 burglaries, then 50 rapes and 13 murders. Like Edwards, his crimes escalated, starting with the burglaries, and the way he was found was quite similar. Not exactly the same, but through DNA genealogy. They went through a family tree, found his great-great-great-great-grandfather dating back to the 1800s, found 25 different family trees, and then ruled out people until they got to him, basically. So a lot more work went into finding the Golden State Killer, but it's just incredible how similar it is. And there is another case that was sent in to us by an overseas listener. It's the Clarke Baldwin case. He was an Iowa truck driver. He's responsible for, he hasn't actually been convicted, but police think he's responsible for the murders of 3 women in the early 90s. It's a 29-year-old case. He was also charged previously with rape, and the clues that got to solve his case were stacked away in police boxes for 20-odd years. It was only because one of the police officers thought, well, how cool would it be if I were to solve a cold case? So joined up with someone and said, let's go look. They dug through old files, found how these cases were quite similar. They eventually found who they thought was going to be the perpetrator, followed him, got his DNA off a peach can, orange peelings and a soda collected from his rubbish. And, how similar is that?
Yeah, that's
Heard
absolutely.
that somewhere before.
The police commissioner actually said to me at the time, this case is, even though we were trying to do the FBI profiling, which you can do in a place like the United States, he said this is going to get down to good old-fashioned police work. And that's exactly what happened in the end, just going through file by file by file.
And of course, forensics and DNA is absolutely the key in all of these cold cases that are now being solved decades and decades later. And Tim, you mentioned the kimono earlier and talked about how that investigation was hitting the brick walls. But after that, there was another very bizarre chain of events.
Yeah, so regular listeners will remember sliding doors moments or those little moments that changed the whole investigation, and this was one of them. So when they got to the break-in in Huntingdale, what had happened was the year earlier, a lady called Victoria Clarke had been murdered in Victoria Park. Her body had been found in her flat. She'd been raped. She'd been strangled with her own track pants, and obviously horrendous crime, very serious crime, which was taken very seriously by the police. So they set up their own little task force. And they called it the Southside Rapist Task Force or something along those lines, because they were convinced this person would have struck before and it escalated up. So they had this little mini task force going, and when they expanded it out, they told all the detectives to look for break-ins with a sexual motive. And when February '88, when Huntingdale happened, that fell in under that auspice. So some detectives, young detectives at the time, were placed onto that and told to go and investigate. Without the Victoria Clarke murder, I'm convinced, and so is the former copper that I spoke to for the book, that if that hadn't happened, then they wouldn't have looked as closely at Huntingdale. It would have just been a break-in, a bit weird, but, you know. So that's the first sliding door. So they're looking. But after a couple of days, they've got this kimono, they've got these knotted tights, they've got a very distressed young girl, they've got a phone unplugged, so they know that something is going on, but they just can't get any further. So the detective who was running the case had a mate who came to him one evening and said, I've got another mate down the road who's trains dogs as a hobby. And one of those training things is sniffer dogs, that he's training them to be sniffer dogs. At this point, sniffer dogs are not a thing in West Australian police at all. He said, what do you think? Should we have a go? And the detective says, why not? What have we got to lose? So they did. They brought these two dogs, gave the dogs the kimono that found at Huntingdale to sniff, and set them off. And as I mentioned before, some of the houses didn't have fences on the back. So the detective who told me this said he was stood in the middle of a field with three of his colleagues watching these two dogs go like this, thinking they look pissed and it's never going to work. These dogs independently went straight to the same back door, sliding door, sat down and looked. And the detectives looked at each other and said, I can't believe that's just happened. So they clocked the house, and his mate said, well, let's do it again later with two different dogs just to make doubly sure. So they did. So they brought two more dogs back. The dogs did exactly the same route and went exactly the same house. So the detectives knocked on the door, thinking that they had their perp. They thought at this point, well, this must be our man. This must be our boy. Knocked on the house. A couple, middle-aged couple lived there. Two of them took the male occupant of the house. Two of them took the female occupant of the house and grilled them, seriously grilled them. What do you know about this kimono? That's my kimono. This is what the lady said. That's my kimono, and I can prove it. And she produced the sash of the kimono that matched the kimono that was left in Huntingdale. So they knew they had the right house, and they thought they had the right man. But unfortunately for them, the couple had a rock-solid alibi. They were actually out that night. So that's the second sliding door moment. The fact that they found the fact that he had these dogs, the fact that the dogs did their job, the fact that they went to the right house, the fact that they got the kimono, and then they knew that the kimono had been stolen. So that is when they went back and said, right, we need to look at all these things, all this area, as anything else happened like this. And that list of 10 that I just mentioned 20 minutes ago came up. And in that list of 10 was one of them, the sliding door, where 4 latent fingerprints were taken, put in a box, and stored for 30 years. And so that's the third sliding door, is that the guy that took those fingerprint lifters was a guy called Murray Smallpage, who ended up being a very, very, very senior officer in this state and very, very well renowned for being super meticulous. And it just so happened that the detective who was running the case knew Murray from the academy and said, can you come and help me be my exhibits officer on this particular investigation? And so that's 4 sliding doors in Huntingdale, and 1 sliding door with 4 fingerprints on it that eventually gave them a name, which eventually led to...
Yeah, I mean, it took decades, but thank God that this evidence was held and stored and dragged back out at a later date. And, almost thank goodness as well that there was this other case that led it to Huntingdale. Ali, do you remember the Southside rapist case?
I remember it only as Tim was saying, because the quirky similarity of Victoria Clarke and Victoria Park, but also that was a case where the rapist did turn into a killer, but not the sort of serial killer. I understood it was like a home invasion, a break-in, and he, like most rapists who are trying to subdue their victim, will accidentally strangle or suffocate them and turn into a killer.
Yeah. This guy did turn into a multiple killer, though, a guy called David Masters. He was Victoria Clarke's killer. He killed again after that, fled to Queensland, and he was actually he wasn't actually caught. He confessed. He was confessing to the one murder,
And to the other one, there was another one about a girl
Yeah.
who he drove from to Queensland or somewhere. He
From
was
Darwin
picked her
or
up.
something?
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
two. There were two, but the other patterns of a serial killer goes out stalking specifically to kill.
Yeah.
I just don't think there's any way you can predict that
No.
from anything. I mean, you could look at events that have happened that has happened a million times. They don't turn into serial
The
killers.
benefit
you know.
of hindsight
Yes,
as well.
wonderful
Yeah,
hindsight.
that's right, yeah. And of course, we did see in this case there was very clear escalation after Huntingdale. Edwards struck again in 1990 when he ambushed Wendy Davis at Hollywood Hospital. And then in 1995, of course, in the trial, we heard the horrific details of the rape of a young teenager at Karrakatta. And Tim, I didn't know, but after leaving the cemetery to go in search for help, she still very much feared for her life, and for good reason.
Yeah, this I've read it, and the account of this I've read her statements numerous times now, having done the trial and writing the book, and it still gives me chills what happened to her on that night, and yeah, so after the attack, and she'd be dumped in the bushes and then dumped in the bushes again, it's at that point that Carmel Barber-Gallo, in her closing, said she postulated that was when Edwards would have killed her, or could have killed her, and maybe would have killed her, unless another sliding door. She couldn't really say why, although there were security guards, and there were a couple of security guards that gave evidence at the trial about the laps that they were doing and torches and the like. So she managed to escape, as we know.
And she didn't scream.
No.
She played dead.
Yeah.
Naked from the waist down. When myself and Kate did the video of the places of the trial that you might have seen online, we did that route that she would have walked up past the cemetery, and then there's a couple of turns, and it's a good 750 metres, maybe a kilometre
Yeah.
at least.
Across
She would
a
have
lot
been
of houses as well.
yeah, but probably not as many at that time. But she's semi-naked from the waist down. A horrific ordeal, obviously. Just before she got to the hospital, she saw a white van, which is interesting because the security guard, Wayne Wookie, at the hospital also saw a white van, which we now know he identified as a Telstra van. But yes, so the young lady, she saw a white van, panicked, or self-preservation kicked in, really, and hid again for a long time while that van went past her. We will never know whether it was Edwards recirculating, looking for her, whether it was coincidentally another white vehicle in the area. But yeah, it's just another layer of terror that you can imagine what she was feeling at that time, and then to think he might be coming back for me, which is what Carmel Barber-Gallo told Justice Hall she thought he was going to do.
Yeah, it's unimaginable, that journey that she took in trying to get to safety and trying to get to help, and wondering if this person was circling the block, coming back for her. Ali, I think what was so very interesting during the trial was the bond that was formed between the victims, who we know came to the trial, and of course the victims' families.
Absolutely. The two surviving victims came right from the very first start and continued to come, as did the families. They were very, very heavily protected. I've never seen the protection and security around a family like that. They had their own section. They were taken in special entrance. They were taken out a special way, except for the ones who wanted to walk out the front. But certainly the two victims of the sexual assaults and the rape were very, very strong in coming forward. I do know the Karrakatta rape victim through very, very close friends, and she's a very strong, very, very brave person. And the horrendous part about that particular rape too, it was a shocking thing you'd see straight out of a horror movie, where she was dragged off the street. She was 17. She just virtually left school in her own neighbourhood. And she was hogtied with a hood over her head. She didn't know whether she was going to live or die, but she had the sort of presence of mind at the time to stay quiet. And then when he moved her a couple of times and pushed her in the bushes, that's when she got up and ran. So she had the presence of mind and survival instincts to do that.
Yeah, and I think during the trial, I think the victims were the front of everybody's minds throughout the course of the trial.
Absolutely. It was very awkward dealing, because we dealt very closely with these families right from the start and became emotionally involved. But then when we cover the trial, you've got to sort of remember rather that we're there then at the trial as journalists, not as support members or family or friends. And I did understand that there was a lot of angst from the families to certain aspects of the reporting.
Yeah.
As reporters, we can't really minimise or sanitise the facts that we're doing. We've got to give a fair and accurate report. The judge was very, very careful. And in fact, one time he actually closed the court and realised that by closing the court or suppressing the fact that we couldn't describe how these girls were killed, which was the crux of the whole trial, and what everybody wanted to know, that by us going on television and writing the newspaper, that we were told today how these girls were killed, but we can't tell you. Well, he opened the court immediately the next day because he realised that you do so much to protect the family, but the family were there. They knew exactly, as was everybody who went into that courtroom knew. Yeah. And so there was this sensitivity, certainly to do with items that we wouldn't report as reporters anyway. We do have our self-regulatory rules of what we report and how we paraphrase very graphic, very gruesome, very confronting or intimate details. But of course, being family members, they were a bit sensitive to what we reported. So it was very awkward and very difficult, and I do understand that.
Yeah, and I think, at the end of the day, as a community, I think we all felt a sense, we felt protective of these victims, the surviving victims and the victims that were gone and their families. And as a community, we almost felt like we wanted to protect them from any further grief that they could possibly be.
But that's the
having to go
balancing
through.
act you've got to do as a reporter. You do. Of course you feel sympathy, and of course you feel protective. And with a trial of that length, 7 months, you see them in the cafe, you see them in the lift, you see them in the foyer. You say good day. You ask how they are, but you don't want to impose at the same time. Yeah. And it's a balancing act. It is. And sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes you go too far the other way and read the paper and you think, I haven't gone hard enough there. And you do cop it. I know Ali copped it. I know I copped it at stages. But that's part of the process as well. It's part of the job.
I think too, often the defence have got to put their case forward, and the defence lawyer Paul Jovich came up with a fairly bombshell opening when he said you've got the wrong guy and the evidence is contaminated. So when it got to that evidence with Path West, we did have to report the flaws and the mistakes that Path West came under extraordinary scrutiny. I think any profession, if you had to look back on whether you've put the wrong date or the wrong file somewhere, but when this was right at the crux of this case, it looked for a while there that there had been some errors made and that he could get off. Yeah. Well, that disturbed the families. Yeah. But again, we have to do both sides of the story.
And we knew just how heavily invested people were in this case and in this trial. And Kate, we would get emails asking us things like, please don't refer to the victims as girls, they're women.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think while we were doing this, the victims were at the forefront of our minds as well as the victims' families. But everything that we did was... The reason why we're doing this podcast and the reason why the trial is there is because 3 women are dead, and we have to try and respect their memories as well as being, like Ali said, report the facts, but try not to be gratuitous for no reason or give too many intimate details, because obviously that's... we're trying to look after them. But we did, you're right, we did have a lot of emails through to our podcast email just saying that, these 3 women have been in our collective conscience for 24 years, 25 years. We all know their faces, and we heard about their lives for the last 20 years, but particularly in the last 7 months, we heard really intimate details of their lives. We saw the inside of their houses. We saw they just left their house thinking that they're going to come back, and it's just a moment frozen in time, and what their friends described them as, and how they were their last nights. I mean, we heard about Jane becoming upset on her last night, who hasn't, been a little bit drunk and got upset.
Yeah.
Like, you connect so much with them, and I think that's when we decided, we didn't actually speak about it, but I think we all knew that we needed to do this in a way that really had them at the forefront.
Yeah.
It's not about the perpetrator, it's about the victims.
Yeah, and I think, everybody in the community, there's almost this feeling that you know them personally, even if you don't know them. And Tim, I know, in your book, it's interesting you refer to them by their first names.
Yeah, that was a decision I took before I'd even started writing, actually. But it's a strange decision to take, because obviously I didn't know them personally. But like everyone, you feel like you do know, certainly you know their story, and you know parts of them. And it's a little bit what Kate was saying there. It's their story, probably more than a story about Edwards. And I don't mention him at all for the first half of the book. I reference him, obviously, but I don't actually directly address him. It's a lot more about Sarah Jane and Kira, and the police officers, and the families. And when I made the decision in my head, I thought, I'll just see how it goes. But it just did not feel right to refer to them as Ms. Rimmer, Ms. Spears, and Ms. Glennon, even though that's how they were referred to a lot during the trial. It just didn't read right to me, and it didn't sound right in my head when I was putting it together. And so, look, it's not meant in any disrespect at all. It's just it's more it's just more a fact that you feel like you know them, and I feel like the readers will know them too, or certainly by the end of the book they will.
Yeah, and Ali, you obviously, because you were reporting on this case from the very, very beginning, you did know the families and do know the families quite well. And of course, you also know someone quite well was Lance Williams. You met him many times. But I think what I've found interesting about that period of the investigation, the macro investigation, was that he was actually never named as a suspect.
He never was named by police. It was the media who brought him to everybody's attention, because it was such a public following by the police, where they sat outside his house for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, following him to and from work, went into his house, ripped up carpet, dug up the entire backyard. But the police never, ever named him as a suspect, and therefore they didn't name him when he was cleared, so we really didn't know what had happened. We just knew that it went away. But he was a very, very unusual person, and I think the police were damned if they did, damned if they didn't, because he was a guy who admitted to me that he'd driven around that particular block 30 to 40 times in one night. Yeah. Now, to a policeman looking for a serial killer who is targeting that area, here was this guy who said, yes, he picked up young women and drove them between Bayview Terrace and Glyde Street, Mosman Park, which was the exact area where the three had all gone missing. So he was a very unusual person. He took the lie detector test, even though I asked him, haven't you got a lawyer to... He said, no, he was a very submissive person, very obedient, very childlike, with a lot of problems, a lot of psychological problems that made him that way. And I think he had this addictive personality which caused him, he said, I used to drive around obsessively, the same way he told me that he'd given up alcohol on August 3, a certain date at a certain time. So he had that, what today we would probably call being on the spectrum. But he suffered that for many, many years, and he just endured it.
I mean, it's interesting because you've got this guy who is a Claremont serial killer suspect, yet
Yes.
he is an absolute open book.
Totally.
And he even
The lie detector test, yes.
he told you the
Yeah,
questions he
did.
failed.
He did. He said I did ask a lawyer and he told me not to do it. And he said, but I thought I should. And he said, they asked me 6 questions. And the one they asked me, have you ever intentionally hurt anybody? And he said, I couldn't answer that because he said, when we were kids, 5 or 6 years old, he and his younger brother used to hit each other all the time. So he was that childlike in obeying the answer and just giving the answer that...
And the unfortunate thing as well, Ali, is they had this profile.
Totally.
And Macro had made so much of getting this profile. They brought in a guy called Claude Minicini. There was another guy called Dave Caldwell. And they had all this money that Dennis Glennon had raised. And so they had this slush fund, really. And
They didn't want to let it go, actually, in that way.
I was told during the research for the book that David Capehorn was obsessed with FBI profilers and profiling techniques.
Yes.
And one of the detectives actually used his desk for a while when Capehorn was away. And he said it was full of references to profilers and profiling and FBI methods and techniques. So they had this profile, and then they had Lance, and they matched. They said... He'd be very meticulous about his car. He'd have access to
a loner, the usual profile you see.
He'd live at home, and he'd be able to go out at night, but he'd be a regular Joe, and so all these boxes were being ticked all the way along.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
It turns out the profile was pretty much spot on. It just had the wrong blood.
Well, this is the argument. I remember hearing this at the very time about this other police commissioner who said it's all very well you can profile a Quantico profile in a place as diverse as America. So you get it down to a male white, age between such and such.
I could have told you that. But...
Well, then but here in Perth, you've got 90% of the population, whereas over there they can narrow it down through a very, very diverse and quite a different... I mean, you were talking about the Golden State. I was in San Francisco when there were guys were running around at the time, but it's just a different world.
And while a lot of the things matched in terms of the profile, there was a whole pile of things that didn't match, but we didn't know about it at the time. And I'm talking, Tim, of course, about the forensics, which were flying around the place, and it wasn't matching.
No, they couldn't. I mean, and again, so Lance readily gave his DNA, gave his hair, and he didn't have to. He wasn't legally bound by then, but he, as you say, submissive and trying to please and all those type of things.
And the ceiling fell in when they tried to put a listening device up there, and there's no complaints coming out.
No, that's a true story. Lance he worked for the Department of Roads at the time. He just left his desk to go make a cup of tea or get a biscuit or something. Came back, and there's this huge box hanging out of the top of his through his ceiling panel, where the listening device that the police had used had crashed through. And it was farcical at points. There was police
was a bit amateurish,
following Lance, and the media following both of them.
Yes, backwards and forwards, and
so the media surveilling the police who were surveilling Lance. It was the most covert operation in the history of world policing.
He was never ever named. He was never named a suspect.
And Ali's right there as well. So, and Capehorn was accused of naming him in Parliament by John Quigley, and wrote a letter to say, I never actually named him explicitly. That was the media. But I mean, Capehorn was cute about it. The weekend after Lance failed the lie detector test, and that was leaked to the ABC over there.
Gosh, they don't get many leaks.
No, that's why it was so surprising. Capehorn called him a suspect for the first time after that. So if that's not a tacit agreement of the story, and then that emboldened, I think, Channel 10 or someone to actually name him in public. He was called Lance for many years, cryptically, but everyone knew who he was. But going back to Nat's question, yes. So the DNA, hair, and it was being flown all over the place. They took knives out of his car. They had there was a report that there was a knife actually on him on one of these drives. He was carrying a knife. But he was also a very timid person, and he said, I used to carry a knife in the car just in case something happened, not to do something, to protect myself. And they tested, and they tested, and they tested, and they could never get a match. They could never get a match. Now, we're talking primitive days of DNA, but still, wherever they sent it, FBI, Washington, Canberra,
Nothing happened.
The UK, they could never pin it
Not till
on him.
2009.
And then they did get the match in 2008, and they thought, bingo, bango, bongo, here we go.
Not him.
Compared his hair, and it was nowhere near. They were, it was just, they were polar opposites, and that's when they had to make the call, and basically told Lance and his brother, you won't be seeing us anymore.
And, his life had been ruined, there's no doubt about it. And then sadly, 2018, he died of cancer.
He was
young.
Yeah.
He was 60.
But throughout that interview, he wasn't particularly fussed or bothered by any of it. Yeah. Not at all. He was just thought he was, he said, they've got their duty to do, and he didn't seem to get all that stressed. Yeah. He said, I don't like going out that much because I said, they've got to follow me. And it was almost like what a nuisance it was for them. So he said, I don't go out. That's what he said to me.
To cause them trouble.
Because he used to go out and drive a lot. He used to go drive around. I suspect they thought anybody that's driving around that much at night. But that's what he did. He just drove.
He never got an apology, did he?
No. And Dawson said,
Chris Dawson,
the commissioner, said he's not going to get one either. His mum Norma is 87. She's still alive.
Has she asked for an apology?
No, they were very submissive too.
Yeah.
So,
but when we doing the research for the book again, I found that everyone was indignant on Lance's behalf, as Ali mentioned there. His parents, Peter Wagers, the lawyers, even certain elements of the police, John Quigley, everyone sort of spoke up for him apart from Lance himself. And then, as you say, 2018, he was seriously ill with cancer, but didn't want to make a fuss. Right to the end, didn't want to make a fuss. Rang his mum, said, I think I need to go to the hospital, and within a week he was dead.
Oh,
and he's now, in keeping with his life really, there's a very small, understated little plaque in Karrakatta Cemetery next to a very similar, almost identical plaque for his dad, who died very soon after Lance did. And those two little plaques are 500 metres from where Jane's plaque is, just across one of the concrete pathways at Karrakatta. Without the trees and the roses in the way, you could literally see from one end to the other.
And of course, just one person was responsible for this pain and misery and destroying so many lives, and that's Edwards. And, we heard a little bit about his life during the trial, but there was so much more that we didn't hear, some really disturbing stuff.
Yeah. Again, just a very strange individual, horrific monster, obviously, and signs of that from a very, very early age, in his very early teens. There was a story that came out before the trial that wasn't actually included in the trial about when he lived in his family home, and they'd been there a while, but not long, because he left. The Edwards family actually lived in a caravan for many years, because his father, who worked for Telstra for many years, was a team leader, and he used to go out into the bush and do rural connections and things like that. And so the family, Edwards and his brother, and the mother and the father lived in a caravan for most of Edwards' early childhood. Then his sister came along, so there's 5 of them, and that was the decision that they made then to move to Perth. But the family home was, again, pretty uninspiring. No carpets on the floor. They struggled a bit for money. And then, Edwards would have been 13, maybe, early teens anyway. And there's a story that was told, as I say, pre-trial about his family were invited to a barbecue to a neighbour's house, and salads and chops and sausages and probably cans of Emu Export in those days. And the lady of the house who'd invited the Edwardses over went into her bedroom and found Edwards in the bedroom. Didn't think anything of it. They were new to the area. She thought he might be lost or something. Didn't think anything of it until the next day when she went back into her bedroom and found her underwear drawer had been rifled through, basically, and certain bras had definitely been touched and rearranged. And she put two and two together, and we're now pretty certain that's what Edwards was doing in there. But that wasn't part of the trial because Justice Hall basically ruled it inadmissible. He said, it's evidence, but it's not evidence that I can really take into account. It's not really going to get me to a point where I need to be, at the end or the other end of the Edwards's life or criminal career. And then, as we now know, it escalated from there. Yeah. Very undistinguished school career, left at 18, put on his yearbook or his graduation yearbook that his ambition was to be a life member of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, because a bit like Lance, he drank quite heavily through his late teens into his early 20s. Got a job straight out of school, straight into Telstra. And we're pretty sure that was through the connections with his father, who was had worked his way up to team leader, so he was quite well respected in Telstra. But Edwards, he'd shown affinity for computers and things in his teens as well, so the sort of telecommunications thing fitted him anyway. And so from being a very sort of loner, didn't get a girlfriend, had one girlfriend, but it was, which ended pretty quickly in school. Within 3 years, he's married to his first wife. They bought a house. He's under pressure, but we also now know that by then he'd also broken into a house in Huntingdale, grabbed a teenager from behind with a cloth, with a kimono, and he'd also attacked Wendy Davis at Hollywood Hospital in that time. And yet he is still only 23, and so you can see the escalation going already from, nick a drawer to break-ins at Huntingdale, all the way through involving women's underwear, to the attack, to the second attack in the October. Then we jump to Wendy in broad daylight, basically in the middle of the workday.
That's right, and I think it's quite staggering to people how that whole case was handled back then when Wendy Davis was ambushed, by someone who's in her workplace while he's on the job. And I mean, Kate, the fact that this didn't raise more red flags at the time, again, with people who listen to the podcast, they are just, absolutely incensed.
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of emails we had from people saying, how could this have been looked over, and how could he not be charged with anything more than just common assault? And the general sentiment is, if he was charged with something more, like a sexually based,
there was no evidence.
Yeah. And if he'd been charged with that, I mean, he went to a sexual
offenders program.
Well, they just did that. See, we've had this thing, because sitting in court day after day for 50 years, you hear thousands of these, and you can see from both the police and from the actual court itself, this was just a common assault. Now, the word common assault, what do they charge him with? There's the next step up, which is assault causing bodily harm. Mm-hmm. There was no injury. Assault causing grievous bodily harm, certainly no evidence of that. And as you say, that the police would have looked at that, seen 21-year-old, what was he? It wasn't a home invasion. It wasn't in a dark alley. So there was no premeditation. It was in broad daylight in a public office space. So public that he got arrested he got grabbed within a few minutes, and it was all over in a few seconds. There's no way they could have charged him with anything other than common assault.
I would argue that it's a bit more than a common assault, though. I mean,
but that's the charge.
She said that she, I don't know about you.
She said that later.
Well, she never got a statement. She never gave a statement to police.
So she didn't seem to see it as anything more than that.
No, when we did the interview with her, she said you know, I mean, obviously we know now. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I got something shoved over my mouth and was dragged from behind, I would certainly fear for my life as well.
Absolutely, yes.
And I think if I would be enraged if the person who did that got charged with common assault, something that would get them a suspended sentence.
Well, there's nothing more with no evidence.
Yeah.
There was no injury, and the fact that it was all over in a few seconds, and
because she fought back.
She said he kicked off. It lasted about 10 seconds. Now, I'm just looking at this from a police and from a magistrate's point of view. The police charge him with common assault because there is no other charge.
Well, it's deprivation of liberty they could have gone with.
10 seconds.
But if he'd got her into the toilet...
but he didn't.
No.
And so I see in her mind, and I think probably finding out who it was would have exacerbated her fear and aggravated her fear that he's turned into that. But you look at the magistrate, it looks at this and he says, first thing they look at, no record. How old? 21. Good family, solid job, hard worker, all over in a matter of seconds. No one was hurt. And they love this, they showed remorse immediately. Sorry.
Yes.
So, as I said, it wasn't in a home invasion, it was in a public place, and they accepted it as a brain snap. And so that sort of common assault, like a punch in a pub or someone spiking somebody's drink, that's how there were no injuries.
Well, I think also it comes also a little bit back to how Wendy dealt with the incident at the time. She didn't necessarily create a fuss. Her husband was a police officer. Yeah. She just assumed that the police would do the right thing, that everything would take the course that it should, and she didn't kick up a stink. And I actually worked across the road back then at Hollywood Village in 1990 when that happened, and I would have screamed blue murder, and I would have wanted the book thrown at him, and I would have chased it up, but she didn't.
She didn't scream.
Well, she told us that, when she was talking to her husband, they thought the charge that he would get would be something like deprivation of liberty because, obviously he was in the police force.
I think there has to be a time limit. She said 10 seconds of being dragged back as deprivation of liberty is usually a bit longer.
Yeah. One thing I did find really interesting from when we interviewed her for the podcast, she said, and it's been mentioned by the criminologist we spoke to as well. She said when he eventually let go, she looked at him and she said his eyes looked liquid. He had liquid eyes, and that's the criminologist also told us that with psychopaths and with people like that, when they snap and when they go into this different space, their eyes almost look black, like their eyes change. And I found that fascinating, that she remembered that 20 or 30
I don't think
almost.
they would have accepted that as evidence in court.
No, I don't think they would have accepted that, but I just found it just incredible that she remembered that.
Oh,
I mean,
sure
she remembers every
does.
detail, though.
And I'm sure, too, like the Karikata girl, too, once they found out who he was and how close, that would really blow your mind completely.
And
I mean, if she'd found out that the guy who did it was now the Prime Minister of Australia, she might have a completely different aspect and think it's just a snap-off thing. But now that she knows how close and thinks maybe, but I don't know what they could have done. Even if what could they have done? Jailed him for 100 years? No, there's nothing you could do. So
the Telstra response was, very strange.
Yeah.
When you get attacked in your workplace and then you get summoned to that person's workplace and told that, poor bloke, he's got a few problems at the moment, but he's a great worker, and hey, we wouldn't want him to lose his job. Well, that's a bizarre thing
It is bizarre,
to do.
but as you know, in our industry too, if there's been some sort of incident like that, it's gone away very quickly.
Tim, I'm wondering if the handling of that particular incident, I'm wondering if that actually minimised it in Edward's mind, because when you think about the way he explained that incident to his fiancée, do you think that helped him to go, well, it wasn't that bad?
Well,
Tim, how do we know what's going through his mind?
But it could be the other way around, because the way he's always dealt with things, and the way he dealt with things right up until a month before the trial was to deny them to himself, deny them to everyone, and only give the little bits that he needed to keep going. So when he told his he had to tell his first wife, who was his fiancée at the time, because he was supposed to be picking her up from work that afternoon, and he didn't turn up because he was in the cop shop getting processed, and she was left, on her Jack Jones outside the office in the city. So he had to tell her something, but he only told her enough, and he must have told her enough because she was in court. I've been told that definitely she was in court that day when he pleaded guilty and when he got the probation. So she must have known something, but not enough to obviously put her off because they got married soon after that. He minimised it to his second wife. In very early days of their courting, he stopped the car while they were there and said, "Yeah, I had a brain snap. My first wife was putting pressure on me." So he admitted that to her, but it was over in a matter of seconds. I only grabbed her. I didn't hurt her. And the persons or the people that he was really had to be honest with were the two psychologists that he spoke to before the sentencing. And that was when he admitted basically that it was what was going on at home that had forced him into what he did then that day at work. But what we don't know, and we can't know, and we'll never know because there's no records of it, because Telstra can't find them, is what he told work, or what he told his dad, who told work. We don't know. We can't know any of that because there are no records at all. There's no record of the meeting that Wendy swears happens with the manager, where she was basically apologised to, but then brushed aside. Her concerns were brushed aside. There is no record of any disciplinary hearing, no record of any follow-up with Telstra on how young Bradley is doing. The only record we then have is a couple of years later when he gets his promotion. So at that level, it's bizarre that there's no record of it. And I think it speaks volumes that eventually, after a week of trying to get something out of them, they did issue an apology to Wendy about how it was dealt with at the time.
But without that Hollywood incident, they would have had no fingerprints to match up.
Well,
that's exactly right.
that is true. That is the one thing that police did do, is take his fingerprints.
Fingerprints, and that's how they match the fingerprints from the Huntingdale to the Hollywood. Otherwise, they would never have got him.
That's right. And we did hear, obviously we, spoke about Edward's second wife, and I think for a lot of people this is still one of the most frustrating and unanswered questions of this trial, is when Edward's second wife said that, she was sick and tired of the lies, that's why she left the marriage, and she feared for her life. And, we were just, still to this day, everyone's saying, why?
Yeah, and still we get questions into the podcast and people saying, why did she fear for her life? What lies was he telling? Why? And why wasn't she able to tell anyone? I mean, even in the trial when she was being cross-examined by Paul Jovich, she tried to say it again. I was sick of the lies, I feared for my life, and then cut off again. It's a source of frustration for us, but it's one of those things that led her to keep those bank records. So we do have her evidence showed that he did go to Claremont and that he was lying when he said he'd never been to Claremont until 2009 or something like that. It's one of those sources of frustration.
I think there's a ruling somewhere, isn't there, Tim, about lying not in the indication of guilt?
Something like that.
And Tim, I hadn't heard this before, but there was a cryptic clue that their marriage was unravelling.
Yeah, so around about that time that Kate's just mentioned, when she started keeping the records, which is a bit strange in itself. I don't know how many of us in this room have still got their paper bank records from 1997, but Edward's had his in a box in the garage. He had a lot of other things in boxes, which we won't discuss here, but which were a bit more disturbing than that. But so around about that time...
Well, now people want to know what's in the boxes.
Well, read the book, $34.95 on the front on the way up. About mid-August, mid-2014, she'd started keeping these records and was jogging through these cash payments that he was taking out very regularly, once, twice, 3, 4 times a week, $100, $200, $300, $400 in cash, regularly, very regularly, including in Claremont. Around about that time, on her Facebook page, she just posted 3 emojis of 3 monkeys. And one of them had the hands over the ears, one of them had the hands over the eyes, one of them had the hands over the mouth. And then in a post underneath, she just put, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And when I saw that and then married it up with the times of what was happening inside that house, I think I know what she was trying to say, that something really, really bad is going on or has gone on, but I can't talk about it. And she left very soon after that, tried to talk about it in court, and was stopped in her tracks. I know that I get the legal reasons why that they stopped that. You do not want a key witness going off the rails. You do not want an over-emotional witness that might, even if it's just judge alone, that might, bring something on your case that you don't want or you can't get rid of. And so it was Carmel actually that stopped her in the first place. Obviously, Paul didn't want it out there what she was about to say or what she wanted to say. I've had some communication with her through the writing of the book and since the trial. I get the feeling she will tell her story eventually, but she's very determined to do it in her own way, in her own words. I don't think she'll do an interview. I think she might want to write it, where she can have complete control over what the message is, much like the surviving victim of the Burnies did a couple of years ago, when she decided to go public with her story, and was very particular with me about what she wanted in and out. And I get the impression that Edward's second wife will do the same when she's ready. I just hope she sends it to me first.
Well, we can only speculate what was going on in that household, and we were living in such a vacuum of information at the time, weren't we? So, when the arrest did come, it was an absolute bombshell for everybody involved. And Tim, you talk about just how closely guarded a secret this was prior to the arrest.
Yeah, this was fascinating to me as a journo. We spent a lot of time trying to get information out of the police, getting nowhere. But a couple of them who were in the very middle of that very intense bubble in 2016 did sit down with me, and it was fascinating to find out what the process was from the other side. The anxiety, the fear that something was going to leak before the arrest happened. The anxiety of waiting for the DNA result to come back from that Sprite bottle, the decision in the first place to actually put covert on him, and watch him closely. I was told that there was a pretty big fight actually internally in the police. Some very senior officers wanted to go low and slow on him. They wanted to just sit off him for weeks if they could, to just really get a good picture, but the decision was taken eventually by at the very top. No, we know where he is now. We think we know who he is now. We need to get him now, and so that's why they put the covert on him. They got the Sprite bottle. So they had the Sprite bottle. Path West were told it was coming, and it was at priority one. We don't care what else you've got on today. Put it, stick it in a box somewhere, and don't forget about it. But you do it another day. This is number one priority. Path West kept telling the police, you'll have them by 2, you'll have the results by 4. But they were obviously very anxious to get it right. So I've been told that they tested that bottle 3 times in about 6 hours, 8 hours, which is
we'll talk to Brendan about that when
incredible.
We get to Q&A.
I mean, literally every staff member in Path West must have been swabbing and, so eventually the results did come back. The very senior police are waiting on that phone call all day. The phone call came so late that Police Commissioner Carl O'Callaghan, who amazingly wasn't actually in the very centre of it, he didn't know what was going on until he got a call. He'd left for the day. He'd left the police HQ for the day, and got told, "Boss, you need to come back." Carl said, "I'm going out for dinner with my wife. What's this about?" He said, "Boss, you need to come back." Calls were made to other deputy commissioners who'd gone home, media liaison people, lawyers, and there was eventually a round table at the boardroom at Police HQ about 7 o'clock the night before Ed was arrested, and that was when everything was laid out.
Yeah.
But until then, it had been so tightly held in that
It was extraordinary, wasn't it? Because you usually get a leak from somewhere.
Yeah.
Well-
Even though, apart from the ABC
And we know, of course,
you get a
the-
call from a close contact.
Yeah.
and
So
nothing.
detectives on the cold case, the major, the cold crime squad on that floor were warned, if you even take a call from a journalist today, I'm going to sack you. You're gone.
Yeah.
If you even take the call, you're gone. And the floors above and below, so 5 and 7, which are major crime and armed rob, I think, or anyway, senior coppers on either floor, above and below, knew something was going on but weren't told. There were, I would estimate, between 6 and 8 people in Police HQ actually knew what was going on, including one media person who'd had to write the speech that Carl O'Callaghan was to give after the arrest, in the event that the arrest went okay. So yeah, it was fascinating to find out the machinations, and the main anxiety was it was going to get out, and Edwards was going to find out, and he was going to do a runner, and that's what they were really scared about. Even though they'd watched him and he was a man of, they knew he was a creature of habit. He didn't go far,
And of course, we know that it did blow up, and it was a massive, massive event the next day when he was finally arrested. And now, 4 years almost to the day of his arrest, come the 23rd of December, he will be sentenced for the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. So, Kate, Ali, Tim, thank you so much for your time. We will be back for sentencing on the 23rd. That's wherever you get your podcast. Join us then for Claremont in Conversation. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us for this special Claremont the Trial live show, brought to you by the West Australian.